Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. Let's take a look at some of the main stuff during the war, and then we'll take a look at some of the stuff that was going on in the United States. So one of the big things, right, was mobilizing for the war. Americans wanted revenge on Japan. FDR resisted American demands, right? The idea was that one of the things they had talked about at the Atlantic Conference was that Germany would be first, and it made sense, right, from a strategic point of view. One of the ideas would be that the American troops would be used to hold back Japan while we concentrated most of our effort on Germany. The question remained, though, was could the United States mobilize in time? So military production got U.S. out of the or got us out of the depression. Farmers began producing more food, and one of the things that we began to see also is like rationing program took effect, which one of the things that we see is Americans not being wasteful. Labor unions also pledged not to strike during the war to get behind the war itself. In terms of men and women power, 15 million men, 216,000 women. the One of the generals of the war, George Marshall, who later becomes Secretary of State under Eisenhower, he advocated that women be included in the military. At first, Congress laughed at him, but they later saw that he was not joking. And so 216,000 women are going to serve during World War II, not just at home in terms of working, but in terms of the war itself. One of the most famous programs that was created was something called WAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. One of the things that we see too is, and we'll talk more about this with the stuff that was going on at home, was we needed people to continue to farm, and with all the young men off fighting, one of the things that the United States Congress decided to do was institute a program called the Bracero program, and what this program did was it allowed for Mexicans to come into the country to help farm. After the war, the idea was to get rid of some of the Mexicans, and so we actually had a program called Operation Wetback, in which we tried to actually get some of the Mexicans to go back to Mexico. Of course, in this picture, we have Rosie the Riveter, right? Very symbolic of the propaganda that was used during the war to get women to go into the workforce. Interestingly enough, at the end of the war, the propaganda will be that women should go back home. We will have a second great migration during this time, in which more African Americans are going to move into the northern cities, specifically on the West Coast, places like Los Angeles, Long Beach, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, and then of course some of the other cities like Seattle also. 25,000 Native Americans also served in the war, and again, we'll come back to them. In terms of the fighting, one of the first major operations of the United States in the war was something called the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is off the coast of Australia. It happened in May of 1942. The Japanese tried to take Australia. They were not successful, and so it marks the first time Japan had been stopped. It is the first naval battle in history where ships never actually saw each other. All the fighting was done by airplanes on carriers. Then the Japanese thought they wanted to end what they had started at Pearl Harbor. So in June of 1942, Americans broke Japanese code messages, and they intercepted the Japanese at an island called Midway. It becomes a turning point in the War of the Pacific because we destroyed some of the major Japanese carriers, and it actually led to what is called island hopping under General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. So, like I said, island hopping, one of the things that we'll begin to do is try to strategically take some of the islands in the Pacific. One of the group of islands that we began to island hop along was a group of islands called the Solomon Islands. And so one of the islands that we strategically made a choice to go and fight the Japanese at was Guadalcanal. It was Americans' first land offensive of the war, okay, in August of 1942. 19,000 Marines stormed the islands. It was nicknamed the Island of Death because of how many people died. It marks the first time the Japanese are going to be defeated on land. So island hopping continuing, we essentially went to try to liberate the Philippines from Japanese control. And so we had what was called the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. 178,000 Allied troops, 738 ships. It's also called the Battle of the Philippines. The Japanese unleashed 424 kamikaze pilots on this, but it's a huge loss for the Japanese because they lost 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, and over 400 planes in the liberation of the Philippines. Then we decided to open up a second front in Europe, right? And so, but first, in order to make sure that that one of the arguments was, but made by by Winston Churchill, was to attack the soft underbelly of Europe, and that was Italy. And so the decision was made to attack through North Africa first. So some of the people that were in charge, Dwight D. Eisenhower, George Patton, Omar Bradley. And then on the German side, we have Erwin Rommel, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in class. So in Italy, this is a picture of Mussolini and his mistress, right? In August of 1943, Mussolini was eventually defeated. Germany decided to take Italy back and reinstated Mussolini. The Allies took back Rome in June of 1944, and Italy finally surrendered in May of 1945. Then we decided to open up the major Second Front. For 2 years, the U.S. and Great Britain had been planning an invasion of Western Europe. So on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord was unleashed, otherwise known as D-Day. 3 divisions of paratroopers, British, American, and Canadian forces set up Normandy beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. 156,000 troops, 4,000 landing vehicles, 600 warships, and 11,000 planes participated. And so the idea was to open up the Normandy beaches so that we can actually begin the liberation process of England. So by September of 1944, the Allies had liberated France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In December of 1944, Hitler responded with a counterattack known as the Battle of the Bulge. And I'm sorry, but the pictures for some reason didn't come out. It's along the Ardennes Forest. One of the most famous battles is called the Battle of Bastogne. And so it was this brutal winter battle between the Allies and the Germans. Eventually, the Germans are going to surrender the Battle of the Bulge because they literally ran out of fuel. In March 1945, the Americans had reached the Rhine River in Germany. And then in April of 1945, the Soviet army had stormed Berlin. In his underground bunker, Hitler prepared for the end. He married Eva Braun and eventually committed suicide. And so May 8th, 1945 is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. Then back to the Japanese. The United States started again with the island hopping, getting closer and closer to Japan. And so one of the islands that was close to Japan, is known as Iwo Jima. So the U.S. saw Iwo Jima as a critical airbase from which they heavily loaded bombers could reach Japan. So we could actually use it as an airbase. 27,000 Japanese soldiers were guarding it. Only 600 survived. 6,000 American Marines died. Then in April of 1945, April 12th, FDR dies. Harry S. Truman became president. And for the first time, he heard of the famous Manhattan Project. Then we went on to Okinawa, Japanese island. Japan unleashed 1,900 kamikazes. They sunk 300 ships and killed over 5,000 American seamen. On shore, the Americans lost 7,600 soldiers, and Japan lost 110,000 in the Battle of Okinawa. The U.S. began to engage in what is called the firebombing of Japanese cities. Between March and July of 1945, the United States bombed 66 Japanese cities, killing over 3 million people. And this is all before we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which for a lot of Americans was conclusive evidence that the Japanese were not going to surrender. So then finally, Einstein in 1940 wrote a letter to FDR. He talked about how the Germans were preparing by making a bomb. And so Einstein wrote this letter to FDR saying that the United States needed to build it first. The first bomb was tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico. It was called Trinity. And then Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unleashed on the Japanese people on August 6th and 9th, 1945. And the Japanese formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. And this is known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan.